Hello. For this, episode 160 of the ETH for Architecture podcast, I was joined by Professor Christian Schmid, geographer, sociologist, urban researcher, and until recently Professor of Sociology in the Department of Architecture at ETH Zurich. Christian's scholarship is wide and deep, and includes, among many other things, co-authoring the remarkable Switzerland, an urban portrait, with Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, among others. We met, though, to speak about the recent publication in translation of his wonderful book Henri Lefebvre and the Theory of the Production of Space, which came out in English with Verso in 2023. In our discussion, Christian describes his engagement with the great theorist of everyday life, Henri Lefebvre, starting with his own activism, urban revolt no less, as a student in Zurich in 1980. From this, as he tells, Lefebvre was really this kind of philosopher and theorist that really matched somehow our own experiences on the streets in the struggles, and became then a starting point for our collective theory building and collective research. We go from that, through Lefebvre's concept of urbanization, the production of space and its commodification in modern societies, and the role of the architect in that, either as agent or resistance. We turn in the end to the present and future. Where are we now, and where should we aim to go?
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ETH for Architecture. I'm talking today to Christian Schmid. Christian, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your relatively recent book, Henri Lefebvre and the Theory of the Production of Space. I'm very grateful for you being here, so thanks for that, all the way from Zurich. Before we get going on your book, however, would you be so kind, as my guests always do, to introduce yourself?
Well, at the moment, I'm just retiring. I used to be a professor of sociology at the Department of Architecture at ETH Zurich, which is one of the famous architectural schools in the world. But originally, I'm a sociologist and geographer, and I studied in Zurich, and so my entry point to Lefebvre, so why am I doing kind of work on Lefebvre? The background of that is actually an urban revolt, whether you believe it or not, in Zurich.
Did it make the news?
In 1980. So as I can calculate now, of course, I was in my very early 20s at that time. I was a young student, and all of a sudden there were demonstrations starting, and so we as young students, we immediately were became part of that urban revolt in Zurich. And this was I would say, the most intense struggle in Western Europe at that time. So you have the famous, let's say, struggles in Berlin, in West Berlin, about the housing, the squats, or in Amsterdam or in other places. But the most extreme case was Zurich, where there were demonstrations for almost 2 years, and the entire city was somehow changed in that time. And of course the question was, well, what happens here? What is going on? And we were students of geography, and so we thought, well, it has to be something to do with the city. And then we started to study the city. And one of the first theologians we started to read was Henri Lefebvre, and David Harvey and Manuel Castells and some others. But from all of those, Lefebvre was really this kind of philosopher and theorist that really matched somehow our own experiences on the streets, in the struggles, and so that became then a starting point for our collective theory building, and then we made collective research, and then we about 10 years later, we co-founded the International Network for Urban Research and Action. And that network is self-organized and still exists today, about 35 years later. So I think that's somehow the starting point. So, and here Lefebvre played a key role, and at a certain moment I started to um, well, delve deeper into that, and became the topic of my PhD. And this PhD was, of course, written in German, and now, about 3, 4 years ago, finally translated into English in a new version, much more extended version, actualized version. And so now it's also available in English.
It is a wonderful book, and it's a lovely opportunity to have a reader into it. Could you tell me a little bit more about these protests? So they're going on across Central Europe in the late 70s, early 80s. Do they spring off the back of the French student protests of the late 60s, or is this a completely new thing? And I mean, what is the context, the broader social and political context of this? I mean, if you look online, describes the May 1980 Zurich protests escalated into violent confrontations with the police. So this is serious business. Like, what was this about?
Yes. I mean, okay.
Yeah.
So it's no, it is not it is not it is not the movement of 68.
No.
So and of course not from Paris and France. So it is not the summer of love of 67. It was actually punk and much more London that played a role. In the late 70s, and it was a kind of independent protest movements that erupted, basically around the question of the city, basically also about the question of social centers. Famous movement of 1977 in Italy, where there were a lot of social centers, squatted places, that also became a kind of very important moment of resistance and of also urban change. And then basically, of course, as I already mentioned, Berlin, West Berlin and Amsterdam, but also smaller cities. I mean, it was a kind of a moment of disruption. It was a kind of also expression of unrest in a time where the let's say the political situation was quite how shall I express that? I mean, it was a kind of a conservative backlash. You know, it was quite a reactionary backlash in many places, and the main thing was also that the urban questions came up in different ways, but were somehow put under pressure. Particularly the case of Zurich was an extreme case here. So that you had new kind of movements, you had new also expressions in culture. I mentioned punk music, but also a lot of other kind of interests. We could say that the urban became a kind of an important topic. And at that very moment, particularly in Zurich, it was just a very repressive atmosphere, a very backwards oriented atmosphere, a very provincial atmosphere. And everything, you could say, everything that made fun was forbidden. So alternative culture was not accepted as such, was repressed. A lot of restaurants were closed because people smoked joints there, and a lot of kind of repression in everyday life. And in Zurich, that one day it was just an explosion, and these were very violent riots. I mean, it was. I mean, there were hundreds of people were hurt. No, there was many people were thrown into jail, and it was really a massive kind of protest and a kind of and then the main demand of that was to well, was freedom, but was also an autonomous youth center. So finally, a place for young people to gather, to have their music, to have their discussions, and that even became quite quickly reality, but in a very turbulent time. And so, what the main effect was, maybe I come back to that later, but the main effect was that public life in this city changed completely. So, from a very repressive place where even garden restaurants were not allowed, and you had a kind of restaurants had to close at 12, I mean, it was still better than in London, where they had to close at 11 at the time, but nevertheless, and there was suddenly an opening up. And so you could say it was also kind of, um, well, you could say a kind of rediscovery of public space, of something that is open for everybody, where people, we have a wonderful lake, but it wasn't allowed to jump into the lake. There were some bathing areas, but otherwise it was also not allowed to sit on the lawn. And so from today's perspective, it looks like unbelievable. When I tell those stories, nobody believes me, and of the young people, no. So, but it was also a moment then of liberation, and that changed quite quickly. And 2 years later, the movement collapsed through this massive repression, of course, but at the same time it was also an opening, and then Zurich became a very, very open, very exciting city. Actually, for about 10 years, the 1980s were really exciting in this city, and a lot of things were possible, and the city of Zurich started to make a kind of politics of integration, and suddenly alternative culture was subsidized. And for a certain time I worked in a new cultural center in Zurich, which at the time was the largest self-organized cultural center in Europe. So it was a real change, and Zurich became then at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, got a red green government, and so a very different chapter opened up.
It's an amazing story. I mean, I would love to know what happened in this cultural center. Was it like a squat? Like, what happened?
Well, I mean, in the first center, which was the Autonomous Youth Center, I mean, that was legendary, because there everything happened. No, everything. So concerts and discussions and really, I mean, you could say terrible crashes somehow, and somehow also absolutely legendary nights. So there everything was possible. And that was then gone 2 years later, and the city then destroyed that, even demolished that building. But at the center that I worked, and later on at the cultural center Rote Fabrik, it officially belonged to the city of Zurich, and it was heavily subsidized actually, year after year. And it still exists as a bright. It has a wide offer for all sorts of cultural directions, music, punk. Well, punk is now gone, but let's say independent rock music.
I think to say that punk isn't going would upset quite a lot of people.
Okay.
I think some people genuinely think it is, but this is a different context to the one that Lefebvre was writing in. Lefebvre was writing in the 60s, and as your book notes, he didn't have a significant academic impact, but he had an impact on the ground. So his work was activist orientated. Is that a fair description? I mean, what was his context, if you don't mind?
Okay, so Henri Lefebvre, I mean, I have to make it very brief, otherwise we will discuss for 2 hours. So Henri Lefebvre was one of the great French intellectuals.
Yeah.
He was a Marxist, declared Marxist. I don't tell the story now how he became a Marxist. Already in the 1930s, he became a Marxist together with a surrealist. So he was part of a group that was, let's say, a parallel group to the surrealists, and so it was also kind of somehow political and artistic background that he had, and then he became the key intellectual and the key theorist of the French Communist Party. And the interesting thing was that he, because of that story of the 1920s and his kind of socialization in a time in Paris that was really also very agitated and very active, and he had good friends with the Dadaists also. So he didn't become a kind of a Stalinist. No, later. I mean, Communist Party in France became Stalinist. in the already in the 1930s and 40s. But he never became a Stalinist. He somehow kept his kind of activist roots and his interest also in arts and in all sorts of activities, and also in spontaneous activities. And then he became one of the key figures also, or let's say key allies, maybe better, or key teachers of the situationists. So Guy Debord and some of his friends, they studied with Lefebvre as students of Lefebvre at the time in Strasbourg. And so he has really an open kind of Marxism, and he also was very well trained in the German, what I call the German dialectic. So he read German, he understood German, he read Marx, he read Hegel, he read also Nietzsche, and he made a kind of a very different, let's say, kind of open-minded Marxism, and he was very strongly interested in everyday life. So his first books that became famous already immediately after the Second World War were on everyday life. And everyday life meant not let's say, the great ideas, but the kind of simple ideas of people. The everyday life. Let's say the difficulties, but also the pleasures in everyday life, and the desires of people, and their kind of sometimes quite simple interests, but also their kind of hardships. And so I think here you have really one of the first, let's say, philosophers who said, okay, I don't want to be this kind of philosopher. I don't want to have to somehow write about the big ideas. No, I want to write about and to analyze let's say, the very kind of everyday life experiences of people, and their interests, and their pleasures and their concerns.
That's very useful. Thank you very much for that. And this concept of everyday life, which we kind of take quite lightly now, is quite a radical departure, as you suggest, from a more, I don't know if the right word is heroic idea about big concepts, grand schemes. And I think maybe we can come back to that. But Lefebvre's central thesis, or at least of the part of the production of space, is that space itself is a social product and therefore subject to power dynamics. Now, this differed, didn't it, from what had come before, where the city was being understood as a series of built interventions which could be interpreted through various philosophical, political ideas. But Lefebvre actually takes space itself. Could you unpack that a little bit? What does this mean, and how does he unpack this kind of spatial turn?
Well, I mean, the story indeed starts with the question of everyday life. Mm-hmm. And there, because he was studying everyday life, he was at a certain time also in the Pyrenees. I mean, he grew up in the Pyrenees, and then during the Second World War, he was of course as a communist. So he was on the threat. So he somehow hid away in the Pyrenees, wrote his dissertation about a valley in the Pyrenees. And then one day, and then he continued this kind of research. And at one day, very close to the place where he actually grew up, he realized that there is a new town that is under construction. And then he looked at that new town, and then he was shocked because he said, wow. So here in the deepest Pyrenees, we suddenly find here a new town. We are confronted with urbanization. And that was something that became then a main concern of his work. And he tried to understand, what is that? What happened here? What are the consequences? And so in 1968, the moment of the famous May in Paris, actually he was one of the key figures also. And this May 68 actually in Paris started not at the Sorbonne, not in the center of Paris, but in the periphery, in Nanterre. And he was a professor at that time in Nanterre, and his own students were the students that started, let's say, the May revolt in Paris, and from a kind of peripheral point of view. And in the same year, 1968, he wrote the book, which was kind of a pamphlet, The Right to the City. I will come back to that later. But so that was exactly the point. And The Right to the City was a slogan of his students and other kind of young people revolting in the streets of Paris. So and then he became a key, let's say, theoretician of the urban. But the interesting thing is, so in 68, he published that book, The Right to the City. In 1970, 2 years later, he published another book, The Urban Revolution. And in this book, he starts with a famous phrase, I would like to start with a hypothesis, the hypothesis of the complete urbanization of society. And in the same book, he wrote that the city is not a useful concept anymore. I mean, 2 years after his famous book, The Right to the City, he said the city is a pseudo concept. It's not a concept we can work with. It doesn't has value anymore. We can't apply it. We can't use it anymore. And then he developed his concept of urbanization. And then another 4 years later, and he was already in his 70s at that time, he wrote then the book, The Production of Space. And The Production of Space at the time was a book that completely went unnoticed. So, I mean, activists read, of course, The Urban Revolution. I mean, we read it, and was also translated into German. But I mean, this was really the book people read. The Urban Revolution, The Right to the City, depending whether the book was available in their own languages. The Production of Space went completely unnoticed. And only about 20 years later, it had a kind of a revival, or it's even not a revival. I mean, it got noticed. It somehow became famous through postmodern geography. So it was then geography that somehow detected that, and particularly Edward Soja, who then made a lot who applied that concept strongly and made a lot of things out of it. And that was also the moment when his book then was translated into English. So actually in French, it had almost no effect. When it was translated into English, it became kind of a key understanding of let's say, of space, of the production of space. Now, what is the background of that? So that was then also became the spatial turn, which is a bit strange because that spatial turn happened in geography. So you can ask, why in geography? I mean, geography is the science of space, no?
Yeah.
But the point was that here space was still a kind of something that was seen in geography, by the way, also in sociology. But sociology was not interested in space at all. So it was basically a discussion in geography, was something that was seen as a given. You know? So even Edward Soja in his book, Applying Lefebvre, and also somehow celebrating the spatial turn, he still wrote space as such may be a given. Now, that's already philosophically problematic because, according to Lefebvre, space as such doesn't exist. It's not an object. He repeats that and repeats that again and again. It's not an object. It's not like a house or a tree no, it's not something that somehow you can isolate. Okay, I see this is a tree here, and I see this is a house, and this is a group of houses, this kind of thing. No, space doesn't exist as such. You can't say this, I see that space. You can't see space. You need, and that's the core idea behind that, because it's something. No, space could be what is urban space? Well, what is the space of the world? is that the universe? Is that what is the Earth? So is that when the first photograph of the Earth's rise behind the moon from the Apollo mission? Is that space? Or what is a space? No? And even you could go down. What is a street? How you define? You need a definition. So what is that just a kind of band of tarmac? Or is a street includes the street the facades or the houses at the side of the street or what? So here it comes the idea that space is a product, is constantly produced and reproduced through human action. So that's the key idea behind that. And that has, of course, a lot of consequences. But space as such, you can't see it because you need a concept. So everybody knows what a house is, everybody knows what a tree is, it's quite universal. We can understand each other across almost all spoken languages. But space has a lot of different meanings and needs a definition. So if we say, is that a region? Is that a street? Is that a city? Is that a neighborhood? So all the spatial units, is that what is a continent, is not clear. No, it's so where is the border between Europe and Asia? I mean, this is a convention. No, somebody at a certain moment was a convention that the Ural is the border, and then it ends somewhere in a huge plain without any kind of topographical, even not a river, topographical kind of demarcations. And nevertheless, we call this is Europe and this is Asia. So here, all these are concepts, and these concepts are learned and they are conventions, and then we use them in our languages, and then suddenly we realize that we use different words for similar things, and we have suddenly difficulties to even understand each other, and we get a lot of problems with translation, even in, let's say, between German and French or French and English. It's not so clear, no. And you think, this is very clear. What is a suburb? We know what a suburb is. No, we don't know what a suburb is. Nobody knows what a suburb is. There is a certain definitions and some ideas about it. In France, you call that banlieue, and banlieue is not a suburb.
Yeah.
And in Chinese, it has a whole range of terms for different types of areas that you would call in English a suburb. No. So I think here and then you can, of course, look at that. So it's produced, there's a production process. So there are human activities, there are concepts, and there are also experiences that somehow determine what a space means for a society or for different society or for certain parts of the society or even for individuals.
I want to come back to this idea of its production, because then obviously through Lefebvre we understand that it is subject to social hierarchies and dynamics and power. But I want to come back to this idea around the complete urbanization. So Lefebvre comes across this town being built in the Pyrenees, but he doesn't see it as just another town, which would be fairly ordinary experience, particularly in that post-war period, fairly ordinary experience of a town being built, but rather that it is a state of a town, a type of territory that is urban as opposed to metropolitan, I suppose, or as opposed to something distinct. It's a diffused concept. In a way, it's a kind of state of mind. Is that right? Is the urban a socio-psychological state?
Well, I mean, so here you have to unfold the entire theory. Actually, my reason to write that book, which I worked for many years to really reconstruct Lefebvre's theory and to really get into that and to understand what he means and how he applies it, because Lefebvre is not really some of the books are easy to read. No, if you read The Urban Revolution, I always recommend that as also, let's say, now it's summer, if you go to the beach, why not? It's a small book, take it and read it. You will have great fun with it. And you don't have to understand everything. But at a certain moment, of course, I had this kind of idea. It became important to me to really understand how is this theory constructed. And it has, I think, basically these two elements. So the element of the production of space and the element of urbanization as a, let's say, planetary process. This is Lefebvre's words from 1970. So already in 1970, he said urbanization becomes planetary. And so the main thing here is that. So you're right to say, well, in the Pyrenees in the 1950s, it's just a town. And of course, I visited that place, and you're right. No, it's just an industrial town, and the town even didn't grow. I mean, it's had about 10,000 inhabitants. I think it's still about the same size, even half a century later. So, but of course, Lefebvre was also, of course, based in Paris. So what he also saw and experienced was the massive growth of Paris, particularly after the Second World War. No, I mean with all the what are called banlieues. And all the effects it had. I mean, Paris became a heavy metropolis after that time in the 50s and 60s. So I think a key aspect here is that urbanization has very different forms. It can emerge wherever on the planet. So that was finally, I mean, the kind of idea, and we applied that at today's world. So we could say today we see urbanization processes even on the South Pole or in the Himalaya or in the North Sea or even in Amazonia. So we also did research about those processes. So, but in very different forms. I think that's the key point. So it's not necessarily urban, it's just urbanization. Urbanization is a process. Here, the understanding of Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey are very, very close. And it's also not an incident because Harvey developed his concept of urbanization after he had read Lefebvre's books. So here there's quite an understanding, and it's of course it's a Marxist, you could say a Marxist interpretation in both cases, with some differences. But urbanization is the process of let's say, and now the question is what? So the production of space through, in Lefebvre's term, industrialization. So for Lefebvre, urbanization starts with the Industrial Revolution. For Harvey, by the way, the same. At a certain moment when, let's say, the dependency on the earth changed considerably. So at the end of the 18th century, beginning of industrialization in the early 19th century, something dramatic changed, and that was that there is a new energy source available. At the beginning, it was water power, but then it became coal and the steam machine. And that led to factories, and factories needed more workers and to bring together workers. So a kind of agglomeration process came into play, and the workers were brought together. And that was the moment when cities that until that time had 10 to 30,000 inhabitants all over the world, more or less, with some exceptions, of course, when these cities exploded and started to expand. Now, this is one half of the medal. The other half of the medal is, and why were cities not bigger? Because of the metabolic the metabolic restriction. People needed food. They had to eat, and that food had to be produced, and that produced food had to be transported to the city. Now, do that with, let's say, on foot, or do that with some horses, and you realize that the territory, the hinterland of a city, may kind of produce enough food for maybe 10,000, maybe 20,000. In the best case, 30,000 people. That's it. And then the next city comes. It was just not possible to bring the food to the people then anymore. With some exceptions, Rome and centers of empires and certain harbor cities, because with ships it's easier to transport food than with kind of on foot or with horses and stuff. So what the Industrial Revolution changed was not only the factory but also the railroad. No, the locomotives and steamboats. And suddenly it was possible to bring food over thousands of kilometers to certain places. So that's the beginning of urbanization. And you have to think it together. You have to think that, so there is kind of a concentration of machinery, of the means of production, of people on the one hand, and on the other, there is a huge infrastructural network. And that network allows to bring food and raw materials to the cities. And at the same time, this process changes completely the places where the raw materials are produced. They become maybe mining cities, and where the agriculture products are produced. So suddenly it's not kind of production, let's say agriculture production just for subsistence, this kind of subsistence economy, just to nourish the own family, and maybe there is a certain surplus that then is somehow acquired or robbed by the landlords. No, at that very moment, it is also changing the entire way how agriculture products are produced and then transported. So that's the idea behind it. And that starts in the large scale in the mid of the 19th century in Western Europe, in India, in many other places too. No? And here, of course, this would be just to mention that colonialism played a key role in that process of, let's say, the globalization of urbanization.
Yes, that Arendtian idea of the world alienation, this idea of the colonial moment being a moment at which the world becomes documented and then extracted from. And I think she must have been building around the same time as Lefebvre, some of her ideas as well. This idea, though, the core of Lefebvre's model, the production of space, that space is a social product and an ongoing process. I think you've kind of explained what that means, but he uses this, what he calls a double dialectical triad.
Yes.
Why not? If you're a French-speaking Marxist, that's the kind of language you're allowed to use. And this is this double dialectical triad of perceived space, conceived space, and lived space. That's a lot to explain, but maybe you can, I guess, open out those ideas of what space, from the perspective of everyday experience or everyday life, means in this double dialectical triad.
So to make it as simple as possible.
Please.
So Lefebvre started usually with perceived space. So it's very important. It's a kind of phenomenological approach. So it's not about perception as a psychological concept. It's perception as a kind of we could say material process. No, so we have our five senses to perceive the world as humans. No, so we have our eyes, we have our we can touch, we can hear. And so that's the idea behind it. No, so it is a space that can be perceived. We can see it, we can hear it, we can smell it, well, eat it if you like, taste it in that sense, and we can touch it. So that's the let's say very basic idea behind that, and he couples that with the term spatial practice. Now, what is a spatial practice? So if as soon as we move around, and if we make a kind of I don't know, we walk through a meadow, and other people also walk through that meadow, suddenly you have a path, no? So that's already production of space, because it already gives you it gives a certain direction. And then we build the house, which is of course the production of space, and then so all these activities that are related to that, and then we construct a road, and then later is an airport and whatever. No, so this is very simply said. So this first dimension of the production of space, so very physical, material. It leads to a material space, and as you see, that changes something. Once we have a road, the whole situation changed, and suddenly the whole geography changes, and the order of things, and what can be reached in 1 hour changes. And if you have instead of our feet or horses, we have suddenly cars. It changes again, and if you have airplanes and so on. So that's the idea behind it. So everything that, and of course, construction of factories and everything that is related to that. No, I mean the trans ocean kind of shipping lanes. So all that is part of the physical process of the production of space. Now, as I have said, you can't see a space. And Lefebvre, it is really a sentence by Lefebvre. He said, you can't see a space without having it conceived before. And this is exactly the example I brought. So conceived space are all the concepts that we develop to talk about space. So it's a perception. It's it's a conception. So this is a kind of, we have to conceive it, and that's what Lefebvre calls a representation of space. And very French in that sense. So the image of a dog doesn't bark. It's not the dog. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. No, Duchamp. That's this idea. So it's a concept. It's a word. And the word somehow it contains a concept, and it can become much bigger. No, so if we talk about a city, what is a city? That's a concept, and we debate about what a city is, and we have definitions, and we disagree, and there are controversies about it, and for all those kind of questions, we need these kind of terms and concepts. And if you are architects, no, you are the specialists of the producing representations of space. No,
Yeah.
I see in your background, I see models that architects built, and you have renderings and photographs and all sorts of things, and plans and maps. So all that is part of that broad idea of representations of space, and also of conceived space, the production as a production process. And you see here a lot of specialists are involved. So of course, architects, planners, of course, like me, also geographers, and many others who somehow contribute to that conceived space. And then you have the last element, which is lived space, which is in French common term, but which was completely new, doesn't exist in German and doesn't really exist in English. So lived space was then a kind of came out of the translation of espace vécu. You would say experienced space, and so the point is that space works also through you experience it, and you experience it in its materiality. And I mean, my example for that is, okay, the place or the space of your first kiss. will
Mhm.
always be a very special space. No, you will always, once you go to this wherever it was, no, could be anywhere. No, could be a parking spot somewhere, could be a nice, I don't know, idyllic place at a lake or whatever. But whenever you cross that space, your memories come up and you see this space in a very different way. And that's your individual experience of that space. And of course, if a crime happens, it's the same goes on, just in the negative way. But Lefebvre doesn't mean that now the individual, of course, is important, but he also thinks about the collective. And I think the best example, if you go back to Paris, is the Bastille, no, in Paris. So that Bastille was the huge prison in Paris. In the French Revolution, it was stormed by the revolutionaries and demolished. So the Bastille doesn't exist anymore. Nevertheless, it's still there in public memory, in public understandings. It's celebrated, no? And the Place La Bastille is a place where all the demonstrations in Paris, well, maybe end or at least pass. So you can't make a political demonstration without going through the Place La Bastille. No, so that's and that means that so this is kind of experience space, lived space. There is something that is directly linked to your bodily experience. I think that's also important. It's not just something in your dreams. It's not a dream space. It's not just in your head. It's not a fantasy. It's lived. In that sense, it is somehow your own history or your collective or a collective history that was used to be embodied in the people themselves, and then is transmitted through all sorts of stories, and the memories are told, and the kids remember, know that they heard about that, and you read about it, and you have all sorts of imaginaries that are produced out of that. So that's the third part, and together these three dimensions produce space, and all this together, only in their kind of mutual relationship.
Thank you. Lefebvre's discussion isn't simply observational, however. He obviously has a critique at the heart of it, which is that within capitalist societies, within the second half of the 20th century or mid-20th century, post-war Europe, and perhaps even in other places, and certainly perhaps now, that this balance of these three places, this triad, double dialectical triad, is in some way inflected by political relationships. And that, to a certain extent, what capitalism has done is remove certain aspects or foreground other aspects of this triad. Am I getting that right? Because
Yes.
space is understood as producing, in Lefebvre's analysis, as producing social relations, and therefore it can be deployed or it can be leveraged to generate better capitalists, better citizens of capitalist societies. Is that right?
Well, that depends, but basically it's right, of course. Whether they are become better or not is another question. That I would really
We will leave the value judgments out.
I would support, but the point is, just start. So that is the reason why we have to understand the nature of the Industrial Revolution and its relationship to capitalism.
Mhm.
And one of the key elements, I told you already about the change not only in the cities but also in the countryside through the transformation of agriculture into a process that is somehow directed towards the support of urban spaces. So this kind of relationship is key. And of course, the starting point of that is the relationship to the land.
Mm.
Don't forget that if we go back into the 18th century, the land is still not capitalized. It starts in England actually with the enclosure to somehow detach the ground from the traditional system of societies at the time. No, the ground belonged to the village. The ground belonged to the people. The people were bound to the ground. So it was. If you say land and people, yes, it was the people and their land, and they were linked in all sorts of feudal and neo-feudal relationships, and that changed with the beginning of capitalism. So to somehow make out of the land a commodity, that's the point. Where something really fundamentally changes, because at that very moment people don't have their daily resources anymore. No, so subsistence was not guaranteed anymore. I mean, that was the immediate effect. So people had to sell their labor power. This is super Marxist now. They were free. No, they were free. They could move. They were not somehow tied to the land anymore. They were free to move, but they were also free of the means of production. They had no means of production. They had to sell their bodies to get somehow some money, and with that money to buy some food. So this is the basic capitalist relationship. So what really goes through that process is the process of commodification. So everything becomes a commodity. No, it starts indeed with the labor power that becomes a commodity. It starts with the land that becomes a commodity. That means you can sell and buy it, and it ends today with the commodification of space, where you can't, where even space as such, not the land, but space as such, and that are Lefebvre's words, space as such becomes a commodity. So if you are in a city and you sit down, you can't just sit down because this is all regulated, and then you can go to a restaurant. In the restaurant, you could buy a coffee to sit down, but you have to buy that coffee, and depending on the attractiveness of that space, you have to pay a lot of money for that little bit of coffee. No, so and you can think about that. Now, if you go to London, I mean, I was really so mind-boggled. Is the first New Year's Eve, and there's a huge firework. And I mean, all over the world are fireworks at New Year's Eve, and usually this is free. You know, you're just there, and you can enjoy the fireworks for everybody. Not in London anymore. No,
No.
not in London. Yeah, no, the whole inner city area is blocked, and then all these people that didn't buy tickets, they are suddenly somewhere at Trafalgar Square, and meet there and hang out there, and they don't see anything of the fireworks because
No.
the firework is too low. It's over the Thames, and you. So that's the commodification of space. Now, this house space you have. So there's a firework, but it's not for free. You have to pay for it, and you have to book it, and now we can use this example for all sorts of situations.
Yes, I saw that a very similar thing happening when I was doing my PhD research in Gujarat in India, and I was out in a small settlement called Junawada, which was to the northeast of Ahmedabad, and it was in the post-earthquake situation, and there had been communities of semi-nomadic people, pastoral people out there for centuries. But in the wake of the earthquake, their lack of land rights was used as a way of asking them to prove their right to graze their cattle. And obviously they couldn't, but it was a tacit understanding through generations, through centuries. And so the organization I was looking at there was working on this idea of actually identifying ways of granting them land because large-scale corporations were coming in, because there was extraction rights, because there was industrial rights within those spaces. It was a very, very fascinating situation, but exactly that idea that there was these types of space, this triad of spaces, which were being occupied by a capitalist process, the function of which, and this was a point I wanted to ask you about beforehand, the function of which seemed to be the intentional urbanization of an indigenous rural population. And to go back to this idea, is this urbanization, this total urbanization of the world, is it seen as being an intentional instrument of capitalist society or capitalist governance? Or is it an organic process? Or is it a bit of both? Is it all these things happening? I mean, I don't want to say, is there some evil dude making us all urban? But is it a goal? Is it an
Oh, these are
objective?
strategies. I mean, this is a very good example. You just mentioned India. So actually, we did research on that. And there is a great scholar, his name is Nitin Butler. And so he analyzed, actually, at the beginning, he analyzed the urbanization of the extended region of Delhi. And there he realized that there is this motorway program, this national motorway program. And there, at the beginning, he realized, oh, there are this kind of corridor urbanization, which is quite well known in India. So the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, for instance. And then he suddenly realized that there is a new motorway going down in parallel in a certain distance.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went further on and realized there is a huge motorway program that, I mean, the motorway program started some 20, 30 years ago. But what happened in the last about 10 years, and this is a project basically pushed forward by Modi and his we could say conservative or reactionary or nationalist kind of politics and regime. And what comes out here is to produce motorways, even in situations where they don't connect two different cities, where they are just bypassing. And sometimes they just go into open land and they go through peripheries, they go through, let's say, nature reserves, they go through territories of the what we would call, I think, in English, the First Nations of India. And then why doing that? And that's exactly a project for the complete urbanization of India.
Mm.
And I mean, that's a massive process because officially India has only about between 25 and 30% kind of urbanization of the territory, which is a doubtful kind of category anyway. But it is so it doesn't has big. I mean, it has some big cities, but in relation to this huge population of India, it is relatively it is not really strongly urbanized. And now here, these motorways, they are ways to somehow urbanize the country because you have this split between so-called rural and urban territories. In urban territories, you are allowed to construct factories and other kind of urban, let's say, activities. And in the rural, this is meant to be reserved for agriculture. And you're not allowed to let's say, expropriate land that is declared rural for a new factory. I mean, there are huge struggles about that in India, and the way how certain, I mean, you can see that in all the big cities in India actually, the struggle for rural land at the outskirts to make huge, of course, windfall profits if you really urbanize these territories. But the motorways, they allow that. No, suddenly you have a motorway. Along the motorway, you have a kind of wild urbanization processes along left and right from the motorway, and there is a kind of this is a kind of strategic instrument to. So Modi says is a strategic instrument to bring forward the country, to modernize the country. But what it is, in fact, is a strategic instrument to deprive people from their land, to make it very simple. No, and so this is a kind of really a post-colonial project, and this is of course the main goal here is really to so somehow to enclose the land and then to be able to commodify, to sell the land. And that's again the commodification of the land. And that means people are suddenly there without land. And they could use it for grazing their cattle and other uses. And suddenly they don't have access anymore. So it's exactly that process. And it's a strategy. It's a strategy that is a planetary strategy. I could tell you now about Amazonia. I could tell you about many different places that we also did research on, and they show how these processes are going on, and that's intentional. I mean, intentional in the sense of capitalists are intentional because they want to make a profit, and a profit goes always hand in hand with commodification. It's clear they want to sell something, and so you make it a commodity, and the commodification of land is the key process for urbanization.
What can architects do in relation to this? What can people who make cities do? And I don't mean people who make cities in the everyday life sense of the word, because there's things that we can do in our everyday life that kind of, in a way, resist this. But what can the professional designer, planner, urbanist do in response to this spatio-temporal theory of society that you outline? And maybe we should start with that. In your final chapter, you do articulate a kind of, as I say, spatio-temporal theory of society. It would be good to understand that.
Yes, I mean, the point is, I mean, what is really the quality, or I would say the key quality of Lefebvre's theory? And that's my last chapter that then really somehow unfolds that idea that you can use this theory on all scales. So you can analyze the planet with this theory, and you can analyze a street corner with this theory, and everything in between. And that's the reason why then I said it's in a way it's the, let's say, the it's a kind of a theory that is in fact a general social theory, general theory of society, how society works, that not only looks on time. So the classic idea was always to look on time, because it was clear that sociologically social change is, of course, a key concept in sociology and social sciences. But space was always, and that was the reason why there was this spatial turn we discussed at the beginning. Space was always neglected in these concepts and theories. And so Lefebvre embeds space fundamentally into the very, let's say, basics of social theory. So, and so that means we can really use it for all sorts of situations. We can, wherever we have a social question, we can use Lefebvre's theory. I mean, that's somehow the really why it also became so important. So whatever you look at, you can apply it. Now, so geographers can really apply it. So if we could now discuss about climate change and planetary crisis and stuff, we could use Lefebvre. But also, of course, architects. As I said at the beginning, so I taught architects, I mean students of architecture, from their first semester to their masterworks. So I have quite some experience with how to apply Lefebvre's approach. And you can use it very fruitfully also for larger scale projects. I mean, here is because this is really something that is missing in the usual architecture. So urban design is already a problem. And as soon as you're a little bit larger than urban design, this is, oh yeah, architects don't know what to do with that. So if you're ever interested what you can do with that, please have a look on a book. It's open access in the meantime, that we published, and we did it together. So it was a group of 4 architects, Jacques Herzog, Pierre Demeron, Marcel Mali, and Roger Diener, and me. And we had a project for about 5 years where we worked together with students and made a portrait of urban Switzerland, and where we analyzed the entirety of Switzerland and on the tracks of Lefebvre, actually. and where we applied also the theory of complete urbanization. And we thought about what does that mean? No, I mean, the common understanding of Switzerland, of course, is always, oh yes, this is the Alps and cows and stuff. No, this is a very rural country. And I mean, people don't really know that Switzerland was, after England, the most industrialized country of the world in the late 18th century.
Was it really?
Yes, it was. So, but I don't tell the full story now. But and it was already an empire, an industrial empire, exporting textile products to India, actually, still in the late 18th century. So, I mean, just to show that, no. So, so it's really a different world if you look from those perspectives. And so we looked on these kind of rural territories or seemingly rural territories, and just looked at them under the kind of focus of urbanization. And of course, what is important here, urbanization, and that's also your question that came very early on, urbanization has very different facets. So urbanization doesn't mean everything becomes homogeneous. Urbanization means that commodification as an underlying process becomes universal, but at the same time, it can look very, very, very different. This is really important. So it's not everything becomes the same. On the contrary, it could be that even differences are increasing under the impression of urbanization. Now, so if we now go down and say, okay, in the scales, okay, not the entirety of Switzerland, but I mean, maybe what architects, of course, do, they are designing new projects, new housing, new factories. Well, architects are not needed anymore to design factories, but let's say office buildings, skyscrapers, and stuff. So I think here it's so how can we apply that? And I think again it's very helpful to think on this triadic concept that Lefebvre developed. And so I think a key point here is to first of all understand it as a process of material production. All right. Understand it as a process of design. I think people that do architecture, they understand that. What they don't understand is usually, and this is my experience, is how people are using their spaces. So you produce something. So the problem in architecture is you produce something, maybe even in the most, let's say, advanced ways to do that with competitions, architectural competitions. So you design something, and even if there is not the pressure from the investors, but even there's a jury and tries to find out a really good model of architecture, then you have to understand again, okay, but where is the starting point? And the starting point is, of course, the economic calculation. So, and that's always the frustrating moment in architecture, that you cannot, so maybe you have great ideas, and I know that architects have really great ideas, and they do that, and they celebrate that, and they train that, but then all these ideas are suddenly not asked anymore, because there is a calculation behind that. There is a concept behind it, and the concept is, okay, we need a certain profit. So the rate of profit is embedded into your design from the very beginning. In most of the cases, there are some exceptions, but in most of the cases, and then there are all the planning concepts that are embedded in it, and then there are all the institutions that somehow also somehow define this framework. Let's say so authorities, public authorities, planning agencies, and so on. Maybe even the mayor has suddenly an idea and wants a skyscraper, no, and then it will be built. So don't think you're free. No, you are already caught in that system. Okay, now you design it and you make a nice design, and then that's it, and then it's constructed. So already in that construction process, which is then becomes a material process. So how it is how it is really materialized. Very often you think, oh yeah, this is not my problem. I made a design but it is a problem because I will just show you what I mean. Because the point is how people then are confronted with that thing. So they use it, and then we make interviews with people, and then they say, well, what do you think about this kind of new, let's say, new development here in the center of the city or somewhere in the outskirts of the city, in both cases? The reactions very often are, oh, it is so cold. So here we are in Zurich. Yes, in winter it's cold. Yes, and there is a wind that goes through. Yes, in winter. But they say that in summer it is so cold. Why is it so cold? This is a type of architecture that, and now you have to think about. So why do you make this kind of design? Because it's à la mode, as they say in France. No? It's the way how you do it. And in most of the cities today, you have a certain understanding what is a design, what is a modern, a contemporary design. And this is, in most cases, it is an urban design. Now, and that's then the main question. What is the urban? And everybody wants to construct an urban design. And the most urban thing is a skyscraper. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why in the hell is that? Why should a skyscraper be an urban design? How is that possible? Because a skyscraper, so then we have to ask, what is the urban? What is urban life? And here Lefebvre helps you really. So, and he has three concepts for that. And so one is, it's first of all, think about the activities. So the first thing is people are meeting themselves. That's part of the urban. People are meeting, and why do people meet? Because of centralities. Otherwise they wouldn't meet. If you are somewhere in the outskirts, in a housing area, why should somebody go there? No, you go there where the theaters are, you go there where the interesting places are, and the cinemas and the rock concerts, and people on the road, where there are people on the streets, and because there are nice squares and there are nice parks, and there are a lot of or also important, let's say, institutions and universities and hospitals and schools and high schools and universities. So that's centrality. And centrality is a kind of material process, and people meet there because they come to those activities, and there are a lot of people, so they can meet, and maybe they go there just to meet something, or they want to go shopping, and they want to have a wider offer, and not just the offer of the next shopping mall. So that's the reason why people go to centralities. Now Lefebvre, when he developed this idea of the right to the city, he immediately corrected that somehow and said the right to the city is actually a right to centrality. So we need a centrality. So this is why you need a right to centrality, because this is centrality. This brings together, we could say, the social wealth of a society is somehow condensed in these centralities. Now the question is, do you have access to that centrality or not? Is that centrality open for everybody, and can people reach that centrality or not? So that's the first question you have to ask. And then the second question is, how can people meet? So how can they interact? Is the space that you produce here, that you design here, is that really a place where people meet, where it's nice to meet, where you can sit down, without paying, I don't know, $10 for a cup of coffee? Mm-hmm. So here you see it becomes very practical. And then if you continue that idea, so why should be a skyscraper? Why should that be urban? I mean, you meet. Where do you meet in a skyscrapers? in a skyscraper? I mean, in the elevators. And there are sometimes queues in front of the elevators, and then you are in the elevator. Is that an urban space? Come on. I mean, maybe, but not really, no? And then they go down, and then what happens? Do they go down? And that's I mean, if you really have a lot of skyscrapers, like in New York or in Hong Kong, you have so many people that the streets are still full of people. But when you have not many, and that's the normal thing. Even all these kind of central city areas with skyscrapers, and then in most of the cases, I mean, go to Los Angeles and see how many people that are in downtown Los Angeles. It changed in the last years, but in the skyscraper area, there's almost no people. Why? They go down and they go to the parking to the parking lots. And then they take their cars, and you never see them in the public space. So no place for meeting. So skyscrapers are anti-urban in their basic structure. Yeah. So if you have the same volume of built-up structures distributed as in the classical cities, no, as in Paris, where skyscrapers are forbidden in the city of Paris, and in London, where skyscrapers were also forbidden for a long time until that changed. Or you go to Kolkata, the most dense city of the world. And you see these places are full of people, but with skyscrapers, it doesn't help here really. So why is that seen as urban? Now we come to the concept. It's a concept, and now think about again. I mean, why the hell? I mean, if you built the Eiffel Tower, it was a symbol of modernism, and it was a symbol of industrialization and the possibilities that are in industrialization. Okay, fine. And the Eiffel Tower became really a kind of public attraction, and you have songs and films and stuff about the Eiffel Tower. Fine, but I mean skyscrapers. I mean Empire State Building. What is that? It is just an office tower. So skyscrapers usually are office towers. So what are they symbolizing? They are symbolizing the world of global capitalism. Very simple. So there's no reason to somehow find that somehow urban. No, it's not. But in a common understanding, let's say, the living urban space was substituted by great photographs. You take photographs from the skyscraper and you see a huge area with lights during night. No, this famous night light kind of photographs. All this huge territory and all these people that live here. Wow. But you just look at them. It's a representation of the urban. It's not the urban itself. It's not lived urban. And it's now my third point. It's lived space. So what does it mean? And Lefebvre also developed, I think, an important idea about that, the concept of differences. So Lefebvre said an urban space is a space of differences. What does he mean with differences? He means it's a space where people meet and interact, people with their own histories, people with their very different desires and wishes and capacities and interests. They meet, and maybe there is a confrontation. So the urban is never kind of harmonic. It's not the idea of harmony in the urban. There is a kind of a moment of confrontation, but it is a confrontation that can be very productive, and it can be very interesting and can be very exciting. And that's the reason why we go to all these cities that don't offer it anymore. Paris doesn't offer that kind of excitement anymore that it offered some 30 years ago. I can tell you, Berlin also, well, it's still a little bit exciting, but it's of course not the same than 20 years ago, and so we see, and London of course lost a lot of, and so on. We can continue, and Kolkata still has a lot of that excitement, but I mean, just to see how this kind of can happen and can change. And so I think a key point here is that so differences are, let's say, the core of the urban. And this is what brings a society forward. This is also a process of social innovation, not just technological innovation, but social innovation, where new ideas are generated, where new ideas are tried out, where new ideas are fully implemented. And for that, we need a kind of a society that is open and that includes all of different parts of the society, all of them. And that's the core concept of differences. And what we see is that these differences are more and more reduced by is a kind of double kind of, you could say, attack. On the one hand, commodification, and on the other, the state that tries to tame and to let's say pacify that spaces and to make them spaces of consumption. And in a space of consumption, nothing really can happen anymore because it's all controlled. And the state, local states, national states, they play key roles also in this process. So if you are an architect and you think about, so you think about these spaces and how spaces can be open for all parts of the society, where spaces are somehow inviting you to interact, where spaces are inviting you to relax there and to meet people. So interaction is not the idea that you just run around and like in an airport. Airport is not an urban space, could be, but in most of the cases it is not. People are just running to the plane or running to the train or whatever. But a space of interaction, a really kind of urban space, is a space where people have time to sit down and to meet other people and also to let them somehow inspire by all the different people and all the different ideas that are around. And as an architect, how you treat, so those spaces that are usually not treated, and I really know what I'm talking about because we looked at that process in Zurich. And we made an entire project about urban qualities and how we can enhance urban and improve urban qualities. And what came out of that process was that the way how buildings are constructed today, so the contemporary architecture, is indeed anti-urban because it's hermetically, you can't touch it anymore. It's kind of it's a kind of, the materiality is you can't somehow appropriate anymore. You can't change anything. It's sometimes even forbidden to have some signs, or that the shops have make some transformation of the facades, which usually make the attractive public spaces and this kind of attractive urban spaces, and they are just bland. They don't allow you to do anything, and then the public spaces, the in-between spaces, are usually treated very, very poorly. Nobody is responsible for that, and so it's just a kind of space of transit, but not a space to stay and to meet. And I think that's one of the main problems we are facing today in let's say all sorts of new kind of developments. It would be a different thing, but we don't have time for that. But it would be a different thing to discuss about what we call popular urbanization. So urbanization that is made for and by the people themselves, classic ways of urbanization that we see in Mexico City, where half of the city is built by the people themselves. So that's, of course, a very different place. But you as architects, you, of course, are confronted with spaces where an architect is needed, and so there the conditions are usually that you even don't have a say what happens. So the house comes to the ground, and what happens then when it comes to the ground? Oh no, this is not your job. Either they have a landscape architect for that, or nobody looks at it. and then it's just made as it is made. And these are then the spaces that are not urban in that sense, and people feel that. And then what we find out is really, you could go to London, you could go to any place. In Zurich, it was so obvious. So the city of the 19th century and early 20th century is full of people and full of people who meet. And the city of the 21st century is empty. And that's not urban.
And that's not urban. That's a great point to finish on. A very provocative point, but I think a great one to finish on. Thank you so very much, Christian. It's been amazing to hear you talk about this.
Okay, thank you very much for making that possible and insisting.
As Peter Marcuse said so well, neither cities nor places in them are unordered, unplanned. The question is only whose order, who's planning, for what purpose? Want to learn to see a bit of it, of this urban palimpsest? Start with Professor Schmid and his well-good book. There's a link to it in the podcast description and to the good man himself. Go to it, little As for Architecture urban achiever. And thanks for listening.